and this is our second lecture in our biological productivity chapter in oceanography. Hope you are all doing well. If you have not actually watched the biological productivity 1 video, go back and watch that before you proceed into this lecture. Let's go ahead and get started. We're going to do a little bit of review about the last lecture first. So I want to remind everybody that when we talk about biological productivity, what we're really talking about is the amount of carbon that is fixed by primary producers. In other words, how much carbon is changed from carbon dioxide into sugars. And that change occurs through photosynthesis. We talked about the idea that photosynthesis takes solar energy and stores it, converts it into chemical energy in sugars, and respiration does the exact opposite. It takes the energy that is stored in sugars and it releases it so that we can then use that energy to do things like metabolize, get rid of waste, move, reproduce, all of these things that organisms need to do. So these two processes are the exact opposite of one another. Now, plants and phytoplanktons do photosynthesize. They photosynthesize, but they also respire. And then animals only respire, all right? We also talked about the idea of food chains, food webs, and trophic pyramids. That these are three different ways to visualize how matter and energy travel through an ecosystem. So a food chain is a very simplistic way that just visualizes one path for matter and energy. And then we have more complex ways to visualize this. A food web that looks at many, many different ways that matter and energy can travel through an ecosystem. And of course, trophic pyramids, which try to convey the idea that we have more biomass and more energy at the lower levels of an ecosystem compared to the top. It takes a lot of primary producers to produce a small number of apex predators. We also talked about the idea that energy and matter behave differently in an ecosystem. Energy flows through it. It comes in from sunlight that is captured by autotrophs. It is captured by photosynthesizers who change carbon dioxide into sugar. Those sugars travel through the ecosystem, but eventually all of that sugar gets lost. All of that energy gets lost to heat, which dissipates into the atmosphere and eventually out of our planet. So there's a flow of energy that has a beginning and an end. Matter, on the other hand, is cycled through. It's cycled through because we have decomposers that take organic matter, break it down into inorganic nutrients that get taken back up by plants. So matter travels through an ecosystem over and over and over again. And then finally, in our last lecture, we talked about chemosynthesis. Photosynthesis provides the vast majority of sugars on our planet. So it's really what powers ecosystems. But chemosynthesis does occur, tends to occur in very extreme environments. And one of those environments would be the hydrothermal vent community. Today we're going to be looking at ocean food chains and some of the things that influence ocean food chains. And we're specifically going to be looking at the food chain that starts with phytoplankton, moves to zooplankton, and then moves to the nekton, so that the free-swimming fish and things like that. As we think about these food chains, remember that chemical energy flows up the food chain. Remember that energy is used by animals to grow and reproduce. Another key idea is that biomass in a region increases as photosynthesis increases. And biomass is the quantity of living matter in a particular volume of water. So we might measure it in grams per liter of water or in grams per cubic meter of water. So if I were to take a liter of water from the ocean and I were to filter out all of the living matter and weigh it, that would tell me the biomass for that particular area of the ocean. And I can compare biomass between different parts of the ocean by using the same units. If I were to take a liter from here in Georgia versus a liter from up near Maine versus a liter from the middle of the Sargasso Sea or the open ocean, I could then compare biomass, relative amounts of biomass in those places because I'm comparing the same unit. Several factors influence primary productivity, and we're going to be going through these factors today. So this picture is it's from Maine, and one of the things I want you to notice here is that this water, it doesn't look like our water here in Georgia. Our water here in Georgia is very turbid, has a lot of sediment in it that's being carried down from the inland parts of Georgia. So our water tends to be very sort of brownish red. And it doesn't look like a beautiful open ocean that has, that beautiful blue color or even the turquoise water that you would find in the tropics. This water in Maine is very, very green, and that's because it is absolutely chock full of phytoplankton. So this is summer in Maine. You can see that the trees are all green, right? And it's a beautiful summer day. There's a lot of solar radiation that is available for phytoplankton. And so in summer up in Maine and many, many parts of temperate waters, you see waters that look like this that are actually green, not blue, but green because they're so chock full of phytoplankton. So we're going to look at the factors that might cause a particular area in the ocean to look like this versus looking like a blue, beautiful blue ocean instead, okay? The major factors, the two really big important things are solar radiation and the availability of nutrients. But there are a lot of other factors as well, and we'll go over those. Things like upwelling and turbulence, grazing intensity by zooplankton, and turbidity. And that the turbidity part is really important to us here in Georgia because we have very high turbidity. When we think about solar radiation, how it influences the ocean, one of the things that we should realize that only a small fraction of the energy that enters the ocean is actually used by phytoplankton. A very, very tiny, like less than 1%. The solar energy entering the ocean is used by phytoplankton. A lot of that solar energy is actually converted to heat. That does influence photosynthesis. So as we have temperatures below freezing, below 0 degrees, you tend to have very low photosynthesis. And then if it gets too hot, above 40 degrees Celsius, that's about 105 degrees Fahrenheit or so. When it gets above that, photosynthesis also does not work particularly well. That chemical flow doesn't work very well. So there is an influence even by the solar radiation that isn't directly used for photosynthesis. That solar radiation does actually influence the amount of photosynthesis that's happening in a body of water. Now, light penetration into water is limited. As you go deeper into the water, so if we have our y-axis here, as you go deeper, irradiance, meaning the amount of solar radiation, it drops. And you can see it's not linear. It actually has a curve to it. It drops pretty quickly, right? So the very top part of the oceans, you'll get a lot of solar radiation here, but even when you come down just a little bit, you have a big change in the amount of radiance. And then eventually this drops off to just the twilight areas. We're down below the photic zone until it becomes, well, eventually it actually would drop to 0 if you get down into the abysses of the planet. So solar radiation is strongest at the surface in the photic zone. When we think about the amount of carbon that is fixed by photosynthesis, we also have to think about the amount of respiration that has to occur for phytoplanktons to exist, right? So when they photosynthesize, they're storing energy in sugars, but they then need to use that sugar as well to respire, all right? If you have more photosynthesis than respiration, then what we have is positive net primary productivity, right? We call this net primary productivity, and that is the difference between photosynthesis and respiration. When you have more photosynthesis than respiration, then phytoplankton can grow and they can reproduce. But if you have more respiration than photosynthesis, then if you're a phytoplankton, you're in trouble. It's sort of like having a negative bank balance. It's like spending more money than you make, right? You're in trouble. And if you're a phytoplankton that's respiring more than you photosynthesize, then you will die. All right. This only occurs, you only have more photosynthesis than respiration at the top of the water column. And we call this area up here where photosynthesis is greater than respiration. We call this limit here, this border, the compensation depth. So let's take a look at this graph here. So here on our y-axis, we have depth, all right? As you go deeper into the water column, light is becoming less intense. So you can have less photosynthesis. So this green, this shows us the rate of photosynthesis. And one thing you might notice is that it actually has a little bit of a drop off at the very, very top of the ocean. That's because the solar radiation there is so bright that it actually inhibits photosynthesis at the very, very surface. But just below that, we have a very, very high rate of photosynthesis, and then this drops off. So photosynthesis gets smaller and smaller and smaller as you go deeper and deeper and deeper. And of course, eventually it just stops because there's not enough light. Photosynthesis changes with the depth of where a plankton is. But respiration, so this orange part, this is respiration rate. And you can see it's a straight line. It doesn't matter where you are in the ocean. You're going to breathe here, 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 you're going to breathe here. You need to use energy in all of these places. And generally, although not completely, generally that energy is going to be equal no matter what depth you are at. So if you are up here, then you have a lot of photosynthesis occurring, and you also have respiration. If you're a little bit further down, you have some photosynthesis and some respiration, but still more photosynthesis than respiration. So if you're up here, you have more photosynthesis than respiration, and you're in good shape because you can grow and reproduce. But as you get deeper, that photosynthesis drops to a point where it is equal to the amount of respiration, and that's the compensation depth. If you are a plankton and you fall below this, then you do not have plus in your net primary productivity. You have minus. And as an individual plankton, you're going to die. And as a population of plankton, the population of plankton is also going to be wiped away. All right, so this is an important idea that you need to stay up near the surface to photosynthesize more than you respire if you are plankton. Compensation depth differs according to where you are in the ocean because water differs depending on where you are. If you have a lot of turbidity, then compensation depth is going to be much higher. But if it's very, very clear, it's going to be much lower. So if we look at our graph here, on the y-axis, we have depth. And on the x-axis, we have percentage of surface light. So over here, it's 100% of surface light. So this is at the surface. And then as we move further to the right, it's telling us that your light is basically becoming less and less strong. So if you're in coastal waters, you can see that you start to lose intensity of light very, very quickly in that very, very top portion of the water column. And so the compensation depth is very, very high. All right, so it might be only, 5-10 meters below the surface of the water. Let's compare that to really clear tropical seawater. You all see those pictures of, people in the tropics and coral reefs, and it's just beautiful, clear water. It looks different from our water here. Well, light there, it stays intense much, much further down because there's less stuff in the water to get in its way. And that means compensation depth is much, much deeper. So compensation depth differs depending on where you are in the ocean. Now, the second really important part that influences primary productivity is nutrient availability. Some nutrients are much more important than others for phytoplankton, and those tend to be phosphorus, nitrogen, and in the case of diatoms, silicon. So these are really limiting factors. If you are a plankton and you don't have these, then you can't grow. If you've ever fertilized your garden, fertilizer has a lot of pH and nitrogen in it because that's important for plant growth. All right. So this is true. These things, if you want to have a garden in the ocean, you need to have fertilization from phosphorus, nitrogen, and silicon. All right. The ratio at which elements are taken out of seawater, the elements carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, tends to be a very steady ratio. So we know that phytoplanktons use these three elements at a very constant ratio. So these tend to be 116 to 16 to 1. So 116 parts of carbon, 16 parts of nitrogen, and 1 part of phosphorus. This tells us what's important to phytoplankton. So carbon is really important. That makes sense because they are photosynthesizing and they're taking carbon dioxide and they're making sugar out of it, right? Nitrogen then is the next most important thing, and then phosphorus. So this tells us the relative amounts of different elements that phytoplanktons need. Now, carbon is readily available in seawater. There's lots of carbon dioxide that is dissolved in ocean water. So this is not really a limiting nutrient. But nitrogen and phosphorus, they are limiting factors. And silicon is for diatoms as well. Because these elements are not readily available every place. All right. When you have a phytoplankton bloom, we've talked a little bit about phytoplankton blooms already. When we have those blooms, we have a lot of phytoplankton and they're all taking up all the nutrients around them. What tends to happen is these nutrients get used up and become rare, all right? And then all those phytoplanktons that use those nutrients to grow and reproduce, eventually they die. And when they die, those individual planktons, they sink to the bottom and they will remove nutrients from the water column. So when we have growth, we eventually have nutrients removed. And that means that you can have times when nutrients are not particularly available in seawater. And then you don't have very much growth of phytoplankton. It's important that nutrients be available up here above the compensation depth, okay? So think about nutrients in the ocean. If you have nutrients down at the bottom, and actually the bottom is very nutrient rich because there's a lot of decomposers down there. If you have nutrients down here, there's no sunshine down there. So if you don't have sunshine, you can't have growth, right? So nutrients down here are useless. The only nutrients that are useful for phytoplankton are the ones that are above the compensation depth in any particular part of the ocean. So if you don't have nutrients up here, you are not going to have growth, even if you have a lot of sun. This means that you need mixing of the water to get nutrients up into that photic layer, up in above the compensation depth, right? So upwelling and turbulence are really important for primary productivity. These sort of like taking a spatula and mixing up your ingredients when you're making brownies. All right, that spatula is upwelling and turbulence. If you just took your brownie mix and you put in your oil and your egg and your water and then you didn't mix it, but you put it in the oven, you wouldn't have brownies, right? Same thing in the ocean. You need to have mixing, just like in your brownies, to end up with a strong phytoplankton base of the food chain. So, upwelling and turbulence bring nutrient-rich water to the sunny surface, and this increases productivity. When I am talking about upwelling, I'm talking about water being carried from the bottom to the top. All right. And it's not fast. Don't think, like a rushing river. It tends to be slow. So it might be water that's rising just by maybe 10 meters a day. It's slow, but it's also steady. All right. And it carries water from the deep parts of the ocean to the shallow, which carries nutrients along with it. Turbulence is particularly important in coastal and shelf waters because you have a lot of waves there, and the tides also tend to mix the water. So you have turbulence being an important factor in blending up the nutrients and sunshine, so you end up with productivity. Let's look at some different ways that we have upwelling. So near the equator, we tend to have a strong upwelling zone. So let's look at this map here. All right, so this is the equator right here. You can see it's 0 degrees of latitude, and then this is 10 degrees north, and this is 10 degrees south. So this line right here would be our equator. All right, if you have trade winds that are flowing strongly from east to west, and we've talked about the trade winds, right? So the trade winds travel just on either side of the equator, and they're traveling from east to west. Now, we've talked about the fact that in the northern hemisphere, things like to turn to the right. Okay, so water here, it gets pushed by these winds, but it's not pushed in a straight line, it turns to the right. So water on the surface above north of the equator turns to the right. Exactly the opposite happens in the southern hemisphere. This water is being pushed along by the trade winds, but not in a straight line. It's turning to the left. And so you have water that is south of the equator being pushed away from the equator, and you have water north of the equator being pushed away. And that leaves a space here for that wants to have water in it, and the water comes from below. So let's look at this from a cross section. All right, so this is the equator right here. This is 10 degrees north, and this is 10 degrees south. When you have surface water that's being pushed in this direction and being pushed in this direction, well, this water comes up from the bottom and replaces it. So we have a zone of equatorial upwelling that rings the globe. That's one type of upwelling. We also have coastal upwelling, all right? And the example that we have here is in Southern California. So Southern California is on the Pacific, and the wind there is traveling south, all right? It's traveling south along the coast, and it pushes this water along, and that water doesn't get pushed in a straight line. Rather than going in a straight line, it gets pushed to the right. Remember, everything that flows in the northern hemisphere gets turned to the right, all right? Because of the Coriolis effect. So, so this water, even though the wind is going in this direction, the water is turning, and it's turning away from shore. So let's look at the cross section of this. All right, we would have wind coming sort of in this direction, and it pushes the water away from the coast. When that happens, water from the bottom comes up and replaces it. So we have deep water upwelling up into this sunny area here. And this is an example of coastal upwelling. California has it. A really important place that has it would be the coast of Peru on the west coast of South America, and Chile. Africa has it. Europe has it. All of these places have it, and it's on the west coast of those places. All right. So we have coastal upwelling in those places. And finally, we have turbidity. So turbidity tends to occur when you have a lot of of tides, especially coming in and out of estuaries. So here we have a barrier island and another barrier island, and we have a lot of waves and tide that is being pushed into this estuary and sloshing back and forth. So you get a lot of mixing in here, all right? Especially in that inlet. This is an inlet, right? And we have turbulence from waves here, and we have turbulence from tides as well inside the inlet. So these factors, upwelling and turbulence, are the spatula that mixes up the brownies. They are the factor that brings nutrients to sunlight. And so where we have areas of lots of upwelling and lots of turbulence, we tend to have very high primary productivity. And we can see, if we look at the globe, we can see areas where we have a lot of upwelling. So red is wind-driven upwelling, and then we also have some seasonal areas as well that are also wind-driven. And you can see, so we have here along the west coast of California. We have here along the west coast of South America in Peru and Chile. All right. We have the west coast here of Europe and Africa, and here in Africa. Okay. We have some other upwelling here, which we're not going to talk about because it's just a little bit beyond the scope of our course. Finally, we have upwelling all along the equator here, right? So we have this upwelling because the trade winds are pushing water, and that water is turning up this way and turning this way, and it's being replaced by deep water. So these are areas of the world where we have a lot of upwelling. That means that these areas of the world have relatively high primary productivity, lots and lots of phytoplankton that grow there. And when you have lots of phytoplankton, you end up with lots of zooplankton. And when you have lots of zooplankton, you end up with fish and whales and things like that. All right, so this is turbidity. So turbidity is the idea that you can have things in the water besides H2O. So this is actually from the Georgia coast, and you can see it's very, very brownish red, and all of this is basically soil being carried down from the interior parts of Georgia. You can imagine that this really cuts down on the distance that solar radiation can travel into the water column. And so when that happens, you tend to have very, very low primary productivity. It's hard to photosynthesize if there's not any sun, right? So turbidity can be a strong influence, especially in coastal environments like here in Georgia. We tend not to have very high primary productivity because there's so much turbidity. Now let's talk about seasonal variation in productivity and how it differs in different parts of the ocean. All right, so we're going to compare the tropics. We're going to compare temperate waters, places like New England, to Arctic waters. And these all have the same legend. So green, the dotted green is water temperature, red is nutrients, and blue is biomass. And as you go up, that's telling you that there's relatively more of it. And you can see they don't have any numbers here because they're really just talking about relative amounts. And then we're going to be looking at these through the cycle of a year. All right, so you can already see that there are differences in these. Take a look at the tropics and compare that to temperate waters, and then compare those to the Arctic. All right. We're also going to be comparing water temperature and water depth. So we're going to be looking at thermoclines for all three of these waters. Let's start by looking at the tropics. And one of the things that you will notice, let's look at the thermocline, all right? One of the things that you will notice about the thermocline in tropical waters is that it's a permanent thermocline. It's there year-round, and that makes sense. The temperature doesn't change very much there, all right? And the thermocline tends to be relatively deep, okay? Compared to like this is for temperate waters in summer. This is deeper, and it is permanent, all right? So we have constant warm water, and that prevents the mixing of nutrients. That permanent thermocline that separates the warm surface waters from the cold bottom waters, that is always there, and so it prevents mixing. Right? So that means that nutrients stay on the bottom and don't come to the surface. All right. that causes low productivity, and it also causes clear water. When you think about the tropics and beautiful tropical water and how clear it is, it's really clear because it doesn't have any phytoplankton in it, right? So we can look at our yearly cycle here. We have water temperature that is relatively stable, right? Might see a little bit of change, but not very much. And then we have low nutrients all year, and we have relatively low plant biomass. There's some little bits of changes in there, but it's relatively low, okay, especially when we compare it to other parts of the world. Now, there are some exceptions to this. One exception would be in places where there's a lot of upwelling, and a great example of that would be the Galapagos Islands. We've seen pictures of the Galapagos Islands in the past. We've seen pictures of plankton blooms there. So when you have a lot of upwelling, like places that like the Galapagos, you have a very rich food chain. And then another exception is coral reefs because they are unique. And corals have their own way of sort of cheating the system. We're going to talk more about that when we get into ocean habitats. All right, so this is the exception to the idea that the tropics are sort of like a desert. All right. Let's compare this to temperate waters. So temperate waters, let's look at the temperature there, all right? And the temperature differs in winter. In winter, we tend to have no thermocline. And that if there's no thermocline, that means that the water is the same density, the same temperature and density throughout the water column. The top is the same as the bottom. So in winter, it's the same, and that means it is well mixed. In winter, the water is very well mixed in temperate areas, and that's because you have seasons. It gets cold. You have overturn because you have cold then hot and then cold and then hot. You have the melting of ice, all sorts of things like that. So you have in temperate areas in winter, the water column is very well mixed. In summer, you develop a thermocline, all right? And when you have that thermocline, it means that nutrients are stuck at the bottom, whereas sun is at the top. So in summer, nutrients and sun tend to not mix anymore. So what does this look like? That means that we have big changes depending on what season it is. So green is temperature, all right? So in winter, the temperature is low, and then it gets warmer like this, right? And that means if it's low, it means it's very well mixed, okay? And then we have red is the availability of nutrients. And you can see in winter, there's a lot of nutrients available. That's because that water column is well mixed. Right? And then we get into spring. When we get into spring, well, there's lots of nutrients at the surface, and the sun suddenly starts to become intense enough for photosynthesis to occur. And that means that phytoplankton biomass goes up. And here it's going up, right? It goes up. As it goes up, what's happening to nutrients? Nutrients are going down. Think about why that might be. Where are those nutrients going? Those nutrients are being used by phytoplankton and absorbed into their bodies. So as you get more phytoplankton, all those nutrients are getting used up. So they're taken out of the water column. When that happens, when you have low nutrients, eventually new phytoplanktons, this whole time phytoplankton are being made, and when they die off, they're sinking to the bottom and taking nutrients away, right? And the new phytoplankton that are being made start to look around and uh-oh, there's no nutrients. So we tend to have biomass go down after a little while. Okay, so at the end of summer, biomass goes down because those nutrients are no longer available. All right. We do, however, have a little bit of this little bump in the fall, right? Because nutrients become a little bit more available. All right, so you have this two bump thing that happens in temperate waters. All right, so the pattern in temperate waters is that in winter, water is well mixed, but there's not very much sun. In spring, the sun comes along and you have mixed water, so you have a phytoplankton bloom. All right. Then in summer, you have a lot of phytoplankton. You have high grazing by zooplankton. All right, zooplankton come up and start to gobble these away, so their numbers come down, and nutrients are not available anymore, so they're having trouble reproducing. All right, plus you end up with a seasonal thermocline. That means that nutrients are stuck at the bottom. All right, so we tend to have a drop off in biomass. And then water remixes in the fall. There tend to be a lot of storms in the fall in New England, and that remixes the water. So we have this little mini bloom here. So this is what happens in temperate waters. When we look at Arctic waters, one of the things you'll notice about the water is that there's no thermocline. The water column tends to be all one temperature, right? It's all just cold. That means that there's a lot of sorry about that. That means there tends to be a lot of very well mixed water in polar regions. So that's not the limiting factor. Nutrients are not the limiting factor in polar water. Sunshine is the limiting factor. And we see this in our graph here. So this is nutrients. They're always high. Temperature, right? Here it is. Always pretty low. But the sun is intense enough, not during the winter. In the summer, it's intense enough that you tend to get a really, really high peak here in biomass for phytoplankton. All right, and this is a huge peak. If we go back and look at our temperate one, it's not as big as this one. You can see how sharp these lines are. So those are the differences between tropical, temperate, and Arctic waters. We tend to see differences in the amount of primary productivity because the water is different in those places. Let's just think a little bit about how energy moves up the food chain. All right, so sunlight and nutrients are really the big limiting factors. And phytoplankton blooms are the rapid expansion of the phytoplankton population when sunlight and nutrients are abundant. Phytoplankton can reproduce very, very quickly, especially diatoms, because of asexual reproduction. We talked last week about the idea that diatoms, for much of their life cycle, reproduce asexually, and that tends to be very, very fast, so they can take advantage of good conditions. So they can rapidly expand their population. All right, so when sunlight and nutrients are abundant, you have these phytoplankton blooms. That increase in biomass flows up the food chain, but it lags in time. So let's look at how this goes. We have the relative number of organisms over time. So this is between zooplankton and small fish, but we could just as easily have this same kind of lag between phytoplankton and zooplankton. So zooplankton is low here, and as it goes up, right, it reaches this peak. Small fish are also going up, but you can see they go up a little bit later than zooplankton. All right. As these guys increase, their population is increasing, but grazing, predation by small fish is also going up. So eventually the population of small fish gets big enough to start to influence the population of zooplankton. And these guys start to eat all the zooplankton. When that happens, these numbers go down, right? Now imagine that you're a small fish and you're trying to survive as these zooplankton are becoming less and less abundant. It gets harder and harder to eat. So the population of small fish also goes down, but again, it lags. And we see this population over and over throughout ecology, where you have this lag between one part of the food chain and the next. We also see that not all of the biomass and energy is passed up the food chain, all right? It's lost. At each level on the food chain, it is lost. So if we have, this is relative amount, if we have trophic level 1, the amount of phytoplankton here, right? When matter and energy get moved up into trophic level 2, lots of things happen, all right? So some of those phytoplanktons are eaten by herbivores. So say this amount is eaten by herbivores, all right? Everything you eat doesn't actually go into your system. Now think about this. Why do you poop, right? Because you're not taking all of that matter into you. So you're losing biomass just by pooping. And then you have some of that biomass assimilated, but some of it is lost to respiration. If you're moving, if you're thinking, if you're doing anything, getting rid of waste, all of that happens because of respiration. And so you're losing energy and matter because of that. All right. And here, this is everything that's left over. All right. So you have to get rid of some of that also as well, because not everything is going to go into reproduction. You're going to have growth that has nothing to do with what can be passed on. So here they have skeleton and hair. This means these are things that are produced by animals but don't actually go into passing energy on to the next level. If you were just to eat hair, ew, that's gross. But if you were, you wouldn't get any energy out of it, right? So a lot of what's being made is not anything that you can digest. All right. So in reality, there's this amount of phytoplankton. But the next trophic level, this is actually what's available to be passed on. And this actually tends to be about 1/10 of the level below it. And that's true for this transition. It's also true of the transition between carnivores and herbivores. So what we have here, we talked about that trophic pyramid. This is actually what the trophic pyramid tends to look like. It's actually a very, very sharp, right? It goes from big to little, right? Because only 1/10 is passed on. Now let's look at this this cycle in the North Atlantic a little bit more in depth. So we looked earlier at how phytoplankton and zooplankton and fish react to the availability of sun and nutrients. And this is looking at, was a snapshot of just the North Atlantic. So let's look, this is in January, okay? We have very low phytoplankton and low zooplankton. We have a lot of nutrients because the water is well mixed, and we have low light, all right, and low temperature. Now, as light becomes more intense and temperature increases, we tend to have more phytoplankton growing. We have this spring bloom, right? Nutrients become less available here, okay? And that is one of the factors that decreases the phytoplankton biomass, because nutrients are just not available to make new phytoplankton, right? And phytoplankton are dying and carrying nutrients away from the water column as they sink. So we have a decrease. We also have a decrease because look what's happening to the zooplankton, right? The zooplankton are increasing and they're lagging behind. That's typical. They're lagging behind, but as they're increasing, they are starting to graze down the population of phytoplankton. All right, so we have this spring bloom that drops, and then that is followed by a bloom of zooplankton, all right, that lags behind it but also drops. Now we have a little bit of fall mixing here, right, and that gives us this little fall mini bloom that occurs in phytoplankton. And look at what happens here with the zooplankton. There's also a little bit of an increase here in zooplankton. All right, so this sort of brings together all of the factors: nutrients, sunlight, population of our primary producers, and the population of our primary consumers as well, right, over the course of a year. This happens year after year after year in a relatively predictable manner. All right, we're going to end today's lecture by taking a look at this video. We're not going to look at the whole thing. This video about plankton in the oceans. This is produced by NASA, and I'll stop it partway through it and then let you know what's going on.
Seen from space, the blue Earth is unquestionably an ocean planet. Standing at the shore, the ocean looks endless and empty. But below the surface, The ocean is actually brimming with microscopic plants called phytoplankton.
If you were to take an empty Coke can and go scoop up some water from the shore, in the Coke can you would have between order 75 to 100 million phytoplankton in that Coke can.
This invisible forest of phytoplankton is critical to life on Earth. Phytoplankton provide the base of the marine food web. They also help our planet breathe. Through photosynthesis, phytoplankton generate 1/2 of the oxygen produced on Earth that all animals, including humans, need to breathe. The blooms of phytoplankton also take carbon dioxide out of the surface waters, making the ocean an important carbon sink. Like plants on land, phytoplankton need sunlight, water, and nutrients to grow. They thrive in surface waters where the sun's rays reach, and their nutrients come from many places. Cold waters carry essential nutrients from the ocean's lower depths to the hungry surface plants. The trillions of phytoplankton in the ocean are critical to study. But how do researchers track these invisible drifters? Ships move too slowly for a job this big, so researchers look at global distributions of phytoplankton from space. Over the past decade, scientists have deployed Earth-observing satellites to remotely monitor the color of the oceans. By detecting ocean color from space, satellites monitor the abundance of phytoplankton in the water.
The reason that it's so important to study the phytoplankton from space is because it's the only way we can get a perspective of actually what's happening on the entire planet over an entire year, every day, in and out. And by doing this over many years, we can actually see how the Earth is changing from natural forcings, natural factors, as well as hopefully being able to detect changes that are due to human activities.
Okay, folks. Well, I hope you all have a good day. I hope this has been informative. And we have one more lecture in biological productivity coming up. Do remember to answer the questions attached to this in D2L, and I hope you all are well. Please let me know if you need anything, and have a good day.